Yeah, here's a great idea. Let's play a game where we go adventuring in the frozen north. Won't that be a wonder of excitement to flex our creative muscles and use our imaginations to imagine such a cold and barren wasteland? Hey guys, welcome back to Black Magic Craft. It's really cold. I don't know what the temperature currently is. It's probably like minus 35 degrees Celsius or something like that. I don't know. I honestly stopped paying attention to the weather forecasts when last week it was all minus 40s and 50s. Me, with this cold weather, my friends and I have decided to start playing Frostgrave. You may have seen my review video Tuesday where I talked about our first game and my first impressions. Needless to say, I've started building some stuff for Frostgrave. Now this week, I actually had two different video topics that I wanted to do, and I couldn't decide which one would be best. Part of me wanted to do a dollar store challenge, and the other part of me wanted to do big, high detailed Frostgrave terrain boards where I sculpt some really nice paver details and cast it in resin and make it really fancy. Something that I've been wanting to do for D&D but could never justify doing. Oh. Walking through knee-deep snow is really tiring. Anyway, I couldn't decide between the two very, very different subjects. Something really approachable and easy that anyone can do, or something really high detailed, possibly not something everyone wants to do, but could be entertaining. So I left it up to Patreon to decide. And the folks on Patreon, they voted and they decided very clearly on the Frostgrave battle boards. So I set to work making those boards. I wanted these things to be really nice looking, and I wanted to flex my sculpting muscles and utilize molding and casting to duplicate those sculpts. So that's what I did. This is going to end up being a multi-part video because, to be honest, it took me my entire allocated build time for the week just to get to, I'd say, 1/3 of the way done these boards. So today, that's what we're going to be doing. I'm going to be sculpting, molding, casting, and remolding. And then later, we'll move on to mounting them onto some boards and painting them up. I can't remember where my house is. Shit, which backyard is mine? I'm a little lost, guys. If you don't hear from me by Tuesday, send help.
Let me say right out the gate that I'm not making big snowy terrain boards for this game. I already have some snow battle boards, and I'm not looking to make more of those with this project. Frostgrave, while set in a wintry climate, is still set in a city. I also want to make boards that can be multi-use for D&D as well as for staging photos of other minis and terrain. So I wanted to make boards that were brick-lined city streets. I may in the future create some boards that transition from winter wilderness to these city streets, but first it's important to get this basic set completed. Because I wanted the bricks to have sharp, hard details that would be worth molding and casting in resin, I opted to sculpt my master from plasticine rather than foam. Foam is great as a final use product, but when making a mold and casting, you want something that you can sculpt very sharp, refined details into, and plasticine is a great option for that. In my resin door video, I gave a piece of advice that was possibly problematic, and I want to correct that here. I said that you could use anything to sculpt your master with, and I was informed later that this isn't entirely true. Some sculpting clays can actually cause a problem with silicone, which prevents it from fully curing. Plasticine, however, or at least the Craftsmart brand plasticine that I have, seems to work just fine, and I was comfortable using it for this as I had previously used it while making 2-part molds without any issue. I worked the plasticine until it became warm and soft. Then I rolled it out into a layer that was about 1/8 of an inch thick. I textured the slab with aluminum foil, and as you can see, it takes the texture really well. On some medium weight chipboard, I drew out some perfect 3-inch squares to act as a guide for laying my bricks. I cut strips of the plasticine in a few different widths, then sliced those bricks and proceeded to start laying them out on the chipboard. This didn't work nearly as well as I had hoped, as the plasticine really stuck to my cutting board, making it difficult to remove without totally deforming the bricks. After a bit of time and using some sculpting Vaseline, I was able to get the hang of it and eventually transfer the bricks without much issue. I decided to use a bit of hot glue to hold the bricks in place, as they wouldn't really stick to the chipboard without applying so much pressure that it would cause them to deform or flatten out the foil texture, which I really didn't want to do. Eventually, I got a complete tile laid out. My original plan was to make 2 3x3 masters for more variation, but this stage had taken me longer than I expected, so I opted to only make 1. This was a bit of a mistake, as it meant later I could only cast 1 3x3 tile at a time, and that would actually make the overall process take a lot longer as a result. I should have just made 2. I used some foam core strips to create barriers for my silicone mold by hot gluing them directly to the chipboard. I then took that chipboard base and hot glued it to a piece of MDF. I wanted to make sure there was no bend or warp in the master, as this would carry through to the resin castings later. This made sure that the mold created was nice and flat. I then mixed up some of my OOMOO 25 silicone to make the mold. I covered this process in more detail in my previous resin door video if you want to go check that out. And as I mentioned there, the silicone that I have is already well past its shelf life and starting to thicken up, making it very difficult to work with. This is not normal for the material, and fresh silicone should mix and pour easily. I sprayed the master and the mold with mold release to ensure I could easily remove the mold once it cured. Before pouring the majority of the silicone, I used a brush to carefully make sure the entire surface of the master had good coverage. If you don't do this, there's a risk of trapping an air bubble and having a void or loss of detail in your mold, which obviously you don't want. I did my best to shake out any air bubbles, but with the silicone being as thick as it was, this was really hard to bring the air bubbles to the surface. The good news is it doesn't really matter too much. I also wasn't concerned about the mess I was making from the excess silicone, as it easily peels off surfaces once cured. I actually used this excess spillage to test when the silicone is ready to demold, which for OOMOO 25 is about 75 minutes after the pour. The mold thankfully came off really easily and was a success. Although using the plasticine meant that my master kind of fell apart in the process of demolding, which in this case was fine, I made sure that after pouring my first resin copy, I marked it as the first casting so that I knew which copy had the highest detail for future molds. Before pouring my resin, I dust the mold with baby powder. This acts as a mold release without getting any grease on the resin pieces. It also provides a nice matte finish to the resin that makes paint stick to it much better. And importantly, it helps preserve the life of the mold, which is degraded with each resin pour. Using Smoothcast 320, I started pouring tiles. This resin is very easy to use, as it's a 1-to-1 mix ratio, and you can demold in about 10 to 15 minutes. When you pour resin without using a pressure pot, you end up with some air bubbles on the casting surface, but these are easily removed with a knife or dental pick or similar tool.
Okay guys, here's the point in the video where I have to stop the post-production voiceover and just talk to you in real time here, because there's a bunch of little things I want to cover. When mixing resin, it's really important that you mix it thoroughly. The first couple tiles that I poured, I was mixing them in these small little shot glass cups, and one of these tiles took up basically a full one of these, which meant it was hard to mix it. Because it was so full in such a little cup, I didn't mix it vigorously enough, and what happens is you end up with these tiles
that don't fully cure. There's some of part A that stays uncured, or at least takes a very long time. Now, these probably will eventually cure, maybe in several days, but that's obviously not what you want. So use a bigger cup or cut down a big one to the size that's good so you can really mix it really well. Once you start feeling it warm a little bit, then you know it's good to pour, and pour it. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. Second thing is 2 safety precautions. You get all these little air bubbles on the tiles, and you want to pick them off with a little knife or a dental pick. You need to wear safety glasses. It's one of those things where you don't think of it as a very dangerous task. You know, when you go use a table saw, of course you put on safety glasses, but something like this, you might not think about it. The thing is, when you're picking these little bubbles, they fling in all sorts of different directions, and it's only a matter of time. It's a matter of when, not a matter of if, one eventually hits you in the eye, and what you don't want is a sharp little tiny piece of resin scratching your cornea. Don't. So, glasses. The other thing is dusting these molds with baby powder. You don't really think too much about baby powder being dangerous, but when you're dusting and blowing repeatedly, that's a lot of fine dust in the air, so you want to wear a mask. Now here's the real thing I want to talk about. My plan was to cast a bunch of these and glue them to MDF and make 12 by 12 boards. And I wanted to make a 4 by 4 gaming area, which means I would need 16 12 by 12 boards. And I started doing math here. I've currently cast 16 of these tiles, and that was yesterday afternoon and this morning. It takes about 15 minutes to cast each tile because there's 10-minute cure time, mixing, demolding, and you can't really do much else in between because by the time you're pulling one and cleaning one up, there's the next one. So one of these takes about 15 minutes. I really underestimated going into this project how many of these I would need. Just for argument's sake here, quick math. So one 12 by 12 board needs 16 tiles. And I want 16 12 by 12 boards. So 16 times 16, that's I need to make 256 of these. And if they each take 15 minutes to make, that's 3,840 minutes divided by 60 minutes to hours. That's 64 hours I would need to be casting these, solid. And that might be fine to do on your own hobby time. But with this being a channel, what you might not realize is each week, I don't get a full week to build things. I get 2, maybe 2.5 days, and the rest is production, editing, all the other things about running a channel. So it would take me weeks and weeks to get through this. So that's not gonna work. The other issue is that this mold, one of these silicone molds, you're only gonna get 30, maybe 40 pulls out of it before the quality starts degrading. Every time you pull one of these, it damages it a bit. The heat from the resin wears it out. So I would also end up needing to make about 10 of these in the process, which would make it take even longer. But I still want these boards. So I've resigned myself to maybe only doing 9 of them to make a 3x3, and then I'll do border ones that are more like snow or whatever. But that's still a lot of tiles. So what I decided to do is I have enough of these cast now to make a 12 by 12. I'm going to combine 16 of these onto a 12 by 12 board, and I'm gonna pour a new mold. I'm gonna make one big massive mold so I can cast a 12 by 12 tile in one go, which will mean I'll only need to make 16 pours, which will speed up the time. And then I will only have to make one mold. I can get, I think, those 16 out of one mold. And the other nice thing is that, as you saw when I made this one, my silicone is old. It is well past its prime, and it's starting to thicken up and it's starting to fail. I gotta burn through it. So making this one big mold is going to allow me to use up some of that crappy silicone. And that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna make a big mold. This will also allow me to place these nicely on a board and fill in the gap between them so it's solid, so that there won't be too many seams on the finished piece, only where you butt one tile up to the next. So let's do that. So, with the new plan created, I set to work making a 12x12 master. I attached my 3x3 resin tiles to a large sheet of 1/4" MDF using hot glue. While assembling the tiles, I was careful to keep the outline of the square true, as I wanted to have those 12x12 boards fit together as nicely as possible later. I have a feeling that the still won't work out perfectly and I'll end up having to trim them with a table saw or something later, but I want to increase my chances of success as best I can. This proved to be more difficult than expected, as my 3x3 tiles had variation in them. To mitigate some of this variation and create a straight and square perimeter, I used my rotary tool and a straight edge to clean up the edges. Now, a very serious word of caution here. The dust created from sanding resin is quite harmful if inhaled, and it's very, very important to wear a respirator and thoroughly clean up any dust after. In an ideal world, this process would be done in more of a contained area to avoid the dust getting into your work area. But I don't live in an ideal world. I live in a real world with deadlines and obligations. So I was as cautious as I could be. I wore a respirator and I did a really good job cleaning up after with a shop vac. Once I was happy with my layout, I used some more of the plasticine to fill the gaps between the MDF and the resin, and to fill in the gaps between each tile. My hope is that by filling the seams in the tile, I could make it look a little bit like grout, and when the large tiles were poured, that these seams would become less noticeable. In hindsight, if I had knew I would end up going this route of a 12x12 master, I would have just created a 12x12 master with plasticine, and then I would have had a huge interlocking pattern instead of this 3x3 tiled pattern. But, you know, as they say, if ifs and buts were candies and nuts, well, I'd have a better looking Frostgrave tile. To create the form of this mold, I instead used 1/2" XPS foam and glued it right to the MDF. For this amount of silicone, I didn't trust thin foam core and didn't want to take any chances of a mold blowing out. I got to work mixing a huge batch of silicone, and to be honest, I was really happy to be using up this old stuff in such a large quantity. It was at this point I found out that my little scale maxed out at a certain point and just errored, which meant I had to guess at the amount of part B to mix in. Needless to say, this was a little stressful. The silicone was already problematic to work with, and not getting your ratios right can cause curing problems. So I did the best I could at guessing on the ratio, mixed it up, poured it in, and hoped for the best. This was a real leap of faith, as cleaning out uncured silicone from my master would have been a nightmare.
I'm a little bit nervous. Feels like it's curing. Could use a little bit more time. It's a little bit sticky, but the test pot seems to be peelable right now. So I feel like the mix was okay and I can demold this. So I should probably wait a little bit longer, but I'm so anxious. If this doesn't work, so in addition to hoping that this worked, I'm hoping I can pull this mold off while preserving the tiles I laid out so that if I do want to or have to recast this, I can without going through that whole procedure again. So let's just see here, come on. Ooh, it's quite sticky. Oh, I think it worked. This I can remold again if I want. Look at this. We have ourselves a big mold. Okay, looks like
pretty clean. I'm gonna let this cure a little bit longer, and then we'll try pouring some resin in it.
I'm gonna call the first part of this project an official success. I didn't get nearly as far into the project as I thought I would this week, and that's a bit of a bummer, but that's okay. We can pick things up again next week and the following if we have to. I now need to pour a bunch of 12 by 12 tiles in resin and hope that that works, and hopefully I can get enough of them done next week that I can start mounting them and maybe start painting them in the next video. Although I have a feeling painting might roll into episode 3. But again, that's okay. I hope you found this video informative and helpful and entertaining and all that other jazz. If you did, hit that like button and let me know in the comments section below. I really do hope you learned something or were inspired by something within it. If you want to pick up any tools or supplies for your own builds, head over to blackmagicraft.ca. There I have my essential equipment store with links to all of the things that I use and recommend. Those are Amazon affiliate links, and purchasing through them helps fund videos like this. The other way you can help fund these videos and ensure that I can keep making them is by supporting Blackmagic Craft on Patreon. Those funds are crucial to allowing me to dedicate so much time and effort into making these damn videos, because it's a lot of work. Anyways, I would love to have you as the newest member of the Blackmagic Craft Fellowship. That's it for this week, guys. I will see you again next week. Good news is I didn't die from freezing to death lost in the woods. Cheers.